Hi guys, the first video on this description of transition or flare to landing was corrupted. That's why it's taken me so long to get it back to you. It's now 5 o'clock in the morning and I'm recording another one because I just feel so bad that I couldn't retrieve the other file. All right, so this is part 2 of consistent landings. The first video that you saw on Facebook was about aim point exercises and aim point exercises around a corner. Now, the second easiest way to ensure consistent landings, or the second most common problem, is inconsistent flare to touchdown or transitional landing, right? So if we have our runway here, having the student focus on the aim point on the way in was the first video, and then once at an appropriate spot above that runway, then transition from a nose down approach attitude to a nose up touchdown attitude. The main things that go wrong on this one is the quickness or the speed at which the student pulls back. So if they pull back too fast, then they end up ballooning, right? If they don't pull back fast enough, then they end up touching down flat or bouncing, right? If they don't pull back fast enough and their descent rate is really, really high, then they end up touching down really, really fast and bouncing and heading back up again, or touching down flat or nose wheel low. So before any of this, during the aim point exercises, I'm hoping that you and your student, or you and your instructor, are focusing on getting the trim, because if you are trimmed and stable on the way in, this is what it looks like. And if you're not trimmed and stable on the way in, this is what it looks like, right? So if you're coming in like this, how easy do you think it is going to be to use the visual cues outside to see what you have to see? Probably not that easy. So having a trimmed and stable approach during that aim point exercise is essential. And then of course, getting close enough to the runway, then you start your transition. Now, many people think that it's the height off the runway that the student has the problem with flaring. That's usually not it. Sometimes it is, but that's usually not it. So what has to happen, assuming that height above the runway and when they start the pull isn't the problem, then what is the problem is actually where the student is looking, okay? So your student up until this point needs to be staring at that aim point on the runway to come all the way in, right? And at a certain distance above the runway, then they're gonna transition from the approach attitude to the touchdown attitude. What do they look at? Where do they move their eyes? That's the big question. So up until this point, they're staring at the aim point on the runway now. And this has to start on the ground before you get in the airplane. This has to start on the ground before you get in the airplane, okay? The student has to know to move their eyes from that aim point exercise up to the end of the runway. I should have pre-prepared a picture or a slide, bad Kimberly bad, but like I said, it's 5 o'clock in the morning and I felt so bad that the last one didn't get, the last one was corrupted, that I wanted to do this right away for you. So let's go with 1, 3. Okay, so let's say that this is the runway. Okay, so the student is here. This is 1, 3 because it's backwards. But what you want to do is have the student move their eyes to the end of the runway. Okay. Now, if they move their eyes to the end of the runway, it's very, very similar to looking down the highway, like miles and miles in the distance on a straight road. You're not looking directly over top of the nose cowling. You never do that in a car, so you'd never do that in the airplane. So you're gonna look all the way down to the end of the runway, and then you're gonna match up the panel. So you're gonna match up, you know, this is your 6-pack gauges, here's your control column. You're gonna match up the nose of the panel. Use better pictures when you're teaching your students, please. The nose of the panel of what you're looking at with, with the end of the runway, okay? So you're gonna match up the nose panel with the end of the runway. And then this is hand-eye coordination. Praise the kids who come in and played a lot of video games. This is hand-eye coordination. So you're gonna use your hands to bring that nose of the panel slowly to the end of the runway, slowly to the end of the runway. The purpose of this is the exact same thing as slow flight, right? So if you spend a bunch of time in slow flight, then your student will have this. If you didn't spend a bunch of time, or you took on a new student who was with the last instructor who didn't master slow flight, This is slow flight. If they didn't do that, head back out to the practice area and master slow flight, please, because this is the essential skill. This is one of the 5 reasons we do slow flight, and it's so they can flare and touch down. That's the whole purpose. But let's say your student out there is really great at slow flight. Let's say you come back into the runway and they know like roughly how much to pull, they know what to look at, but it's still not working, it's still inconsistent. What do you do? What I like to do is, if you are at an airport that will allow you to be on the runway without taking off or landing, so you're at a very low traffic airport, or say a medium traffic airport where you can request permission to be on the runway for 2 or 3 minutes at a time, okay, low traffic, medium traffic airport. If you're at a high traffic airport and this absolutely can't happen, you need to take your student and head out to one of those abandoned airports, not abandoned airports, head out to one of those super low traffic airports so you can do this. And I call it the high-speed taxi exercise. I don't know if this is a real thing because, or in a textbook or taught anywhere else, because I've been using it for so long, I can't remember if I made it up or not. But a high-speed taxi exercise is when you taxi onto the runway, okay? And you, the instructor, should probably practice before you let your student. This is gonna fix 3 major things. Number 1, this is gonna fix the visual cues of what the student is looking at. Number 2, this is gonna fix the pull and the holding practice after they've mastered slow flight, the pull and the holding practice of keeping that nose up when they're first touching down. And third, this is gonna fix the high-speed taxi where they're in the weird transition between not enough airflow over the control surfaces, but kind of a little bit, not enough pressure on the wheels, but kind of a little bit, and helping the student control the aircraft in like the touchdown phase and the rollout phase where you're going really, really fast. So you're gonna request permission or go onto the runway for a couple of minutes, taxi onto the runway, and then you're gonna give it enough power. You're gonna give it enough power so that the nose wheel pops off that runway and you end up kind of wheeling down the runway the entire time. So if you're wheeling down the runway, very much like a soft field takeoff attitude, right? So look at that, that's a fourth fix on this one. The soft field takeoff attitude, you're gonna wheelie down the runway and you're going to point your student to look at where the panel intersects the end of the runway or what the attitude looks like. On touchdown, wheeling down the runway, on touchdown, this is exactly what it's supposed to look like. So this is giving your student the mental screenshot, the mental snapshot of what they're trying to accomplish. So pull that nose wheel off and then pull the power back enough that you don't take off, pull it back enough so that you're just barely holding that nose wheel off. And then of course, at a really smart and safe distance before the end of the runway, you're gonna pull the power off entirely, allow the nose to lower, and then give the student practice with controlling the aircraft, or you practice first, controlling the aircraft as it slows down. So there's lots of things that are gonna be fixed with this one exercise, but it does take a very special environment. So as a summary, as a recap, what you do is you request permission or find a runway that it's going to be safe to be on for 1 to 2 minutes at a time. Okay, so then you taxi onto the runway. You're going to stay straight, make sure you're lined up, point out all of the visual cues of staying straight, what it looks like, being lined up. Then you, the instructor, are going to give it just enough power to lift that nose wheel off and then pull off enough power to just barely keep that nose wheel off, but not take off, and then just wheelie down the runway, because it gives you the visual cues of what the touchdown attitude looks like and what that student has to accomplish in the touchdown attitude, right? It gives the student lots of practice to maintain directional control when you're going really fast. It gives the student practice slowing down and using the brakes appropriately. And it gives a lot of practice for a lot of things. But it does take a very special environment. So make sure that you pull the power off entirely and slow down before the end of the runway. If you don't have enough time, I don't know why I have to say these safety things, but just so nobody points to this video and goes, but Kimberly told me, right? So safely taxi off at the end of the runway, maybe come back to it again. If you're in a very special environment where you can just turn around and go the other way, then great. But the high-speed taxi exercise fixes a ton of things. Let's shut that off here. And I know it's gonna help. If you have any comments, then send me a private message. Bye, guys.